Those of you watching online, I don't want to forget to welcome you. Thank you for joining us, for being a part of our church family via technology today. We're so glad that you can be here. So one of my favorite things about the Christmas season is Christmas movies. Anybody enjoy Christmas movies out there? And one of my favorite movies is Christmas Vacation. Anybody, any Christmas Vacation fans? If you haven't seen it, I don't know if I should tell you to see it or not, but we watched it Friday night again. And, so the story is about Clark Griswold. You probably, most of you know that. And he just wants a good old-fashioned family Christmas for his family, right? And it's like one disaster after another. And there's this word that I think describes the whole movie, and it's the word chaos. The word chaos, which is complete disorder and confusion. And again, it's just like one chaotic event after another. It starts with their infamous trip to the Christmas tree farm. Remember this? And his car gets stuck under the log truck. Yeah, but it just goes downhill. Then there's the light hanging debacle where he nearly kills himself multiple times, and then he finally tries to plug him in, and it doesn't work, right? And then there's Cousin Eddie pulling up with his tenement on wheels. We would all love to have this parked in front of our, our driveway, our house, right? And my very favorite part is when the cat chews on the lights and the fried pussycat. Sorry for you cat lovers out there. And then there's Uncle Lewis with the tree when he catches it on fire. And then the squirrel in the new tree, right? And they're chasing around, the dogs running through the house, tearing stuff down. And then like the one thing that's like at the root of all of it is the Christmas bonus. Will Clark or will Clark not get the Christmas bonus? Because he has overextended himself financially. And there's this underlying stress of, is it going to come? Like, am I going to be able to afford the swimming pool that I put a down payment on that I didn't have money in my account to cover? And again, the result is just total chaos. And I was thinking about how stressful it is to watch that movie, because at the end, you remember like the guys go into the windows and they're like, the whole house is just destroyed. And I think the reason why I like watching the movie is because as much as my life is chaotic during this season, it's not as chaotic as that, right? And as much as there's a mess at Christmas time, it's just not that bad, right? It's just a reminder that things could be worse than what they actually are. And I was just thinking about how this season, right? This season where we celebrate the birth of Jesus, and it's supposed to be so peaceful and calm. And yet, honestly, isn't it just kind of a big ball of chaos for all of us? I mean, most of us, I don't know, maybe you've escaped it. For us, we haven't. Part of the reason we haven't is because of the small people in our house, the children. Remember a couple weeks ago when we had the snow falling on Sunday morning, and I had gotten up to go to Greensburg, and I said to my kids, hey girls, guess what? It's supposed to snow today. And I didn't know that there's like a switch on their backs that says crazy on it, and I flipped it on, and it hasn't shut off since then. I mean, when we put the kids to bed that night, I said to Carrie, this is going to be a long, long season because they've so hyped up, and that hyped upness hasn't changed. And then to go along with that is this thing. Yeah, I heard the groans. Some of you know exactly because you're lying in bed and you're like, did the elf fly back to the North Pole to go to a new place tomorrow? And it's like, oh gosh, get out of the bed. And then there's the presents, right? The chaos of that, especially this year where there are shortages and you're like, did I get the right thing? Is Amazon going to deliver it on time? Then this is one of my favorite ones. Why is it? Somebody, whoever can answer this, you get a prize. Why is it that 2 days before Christmas, the lights in the middle of the tree go out? Right? I mean, why? Why can't it be when you're testing them? And then, of course, there's the baking, the decorating, like just all the stuff that's tied up in this holiday that creates chaos and stress. And how is it that the birth of this baby has turned so chaotic and so stressful? And the thing is, most of us don't like chaos, right? I mean, most of us, we want to bring control to chaos, don't we? That's why some of you, and you know who you are. The day after Christmas, you're tearing it all down, right? Anybody want to admit to that? You're tearing it down. You're putting the tree away. It's like, okay, chaos done. New Year comes. We're finished with this. We're ready to move forward. And the thing is, I think the desire that we have to kind of control the chaos, to bring that to an end, I actually think that's a piece of God's thumbprint on our lives. When we think back to the creation account, the whole world was chaos, the universe was chaos, and God brought order to it. He brought light and dark and day and night, land and sea, male and female. I mean, he just brought all kinds of order and control to the chaos. And so I think that's a piece of God's thumbprint on us. And yet, if we're honest, I think there's a bit of every one of us where we all want to be in control. Everyone wants to be in control. And when we lose control, we fight to get it back. Which is why when the kids are crazy in the back seat, how many of you parents can admit to like reaching back into air, right? Trying to grab them and say, I never thought I would do this. I caught myself saying, don't make me come back there. And they're like, yeah, Dad, we'd like to see that. Honey, Carrie, hold on to the wheel. I'm climbing in the back, right? I mean, that's not going to happen. But I mean, we want to bring some control to the chaos. When you get the diagnosis or, what do? Go to Dr. Google and try and figure out, okay, how can I bring some control to this? How can I, change my diet or exercise more, whatever it is. I mean, we want to control that when we realize our finances are in chaos. It's like, okay, we got to get on a budget. We got to stop the spending. We got to figure this out. When your teens are out of control, what do? You kind of ground them till they're 21. We got to bring some control to this. When the TV is out of control, you take the remote from her. You know what I'm talking about? Guys, we like to control that. Okay, that fell flat, but that's all right. There are lots of ways that we like to gain control, whether it's being louder, being firmer. Sometimes we hide, sometimes we run away. Sometimes we just go after things that we can control, which honestly is kind of the root of addiction, and we're going to talk a little bit about that next week. But the thing is, when things are out of control, we look for someone, whether it's us or someone else, to step up and take control until someone else steps up and take control. And honestly, life in many respects is about people fighting for control. Who's going to get it? Who's going to bring order to the chaos? Who's going to kind of define how we're going to move through this? Who's going to bring some control to this world? And honestly, this is kind of the story of humanity. When we talk about our vision as a church of creating a community where all people can connect to God's story, this is God's story. In fact, the overwhelming question from the beginning of time is, who is going to be in control? And so today we're going to give you a bit of an overview. It's a bit of a history lesson. And if you're not a history buff, I apologize. I'm going to make it as interesting as I can because quite honestly, it is interesting. It is fascinating the way from the beginning of time, the world has been fighting for control. In the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve, God says to them, you can subdue the land, name the animals, you can enjoy this property, but don't eat from that tree. And what do? They say, I'm going to control my destiny, and I'm going to eat from that tree. It's the beginning of time. Abraham, 4,000 years ago, if you know the story of Abraham, Father Abraham had many sons. Many sons had Father Abraham. Maybe you knew the song from BBS growing up. I did. And so 4,000 years ago, God went to Abraham, and he posed essentially a question to him, an opportunity to him of, will you surrender control to me? Take a look in Genesis chapter 12, verse 1, what God said to Abraham. The Lord said to him, go from your country, your people and your father's household to the land I will show you. The land you're familiar with, the land you can control, the people that you've got control over. And then he says this, he says, if you do this, I'm going to make you a promise. He says, I will make you into a great nation and I will bless you. I will make your name great and you will be a blessing. He goes on and says, I will bless those who bless you and whoever curses you, I will curse, and all peoples on earth. I mean, think about the significance of this. He says, all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. Abraham, if you're willing to surrender control to me, I will bless the entire world. Now, this was at a period of time where people didn't bless the world, they conquered the world. Right? I mean, they wanted to take over the world. And yet, if you know much of Abraham's story, you know there were parts in which he fell short, parts in which he did try to control, but ultimately he surrendered control to God. He went where God asked him to go. And even though Abraham was old and his wife Sarah was old, they ended up having this miracle baby named Isaac. And Isaac had two children, Jacob and Esau. And Jacob, he had 12 kids, 12 sons. And one of those sons was Joseph. Perhaps you know the story of Joseph. Joseph was sold by his brothers into slavery. He was unfairly accused by his boss's wife of attempting to rape her. He was unjustly imprisoned for about a decade of his life. And in the midst of all of that chaos that Joseph experienced, he walked in the footsteps of his great-grandfather Abraham. He refused to try and control the chaos. And do you know what happened with Joseph in his life? He blessed his family, which was becoming a nation, ultimately became 1 million+ people. And frankly, he blessed the ancient world because of the way that he protected them from the famine, because he was willing to surrender and give up the one thing that so often we're unwilling to give up and surrender: control. But if you know much of the story of the world, there was a period of time when a pharaoh of Egypt came who didn't know Joseph and imprisoned the Israelites because it was a nation living within a nation. It was a threat. And so they became slaves. And for 400 years, there was chaos for the nation of Israel. 400 years of these people who were Abraham's descendants, until God raised up another person who was willing to surrender control. His name was Moses. And Moses led the people to freedom into the promised land, where God essentially said to the people, look, all these nations around you have their kings, but I want to be your king. As long as you surrender your control to me, I will take responsibility for your future. I'll take responsibility for your life. But Israel was unhappy with that agreement. They wanted a human king. They wanted something or someone they could control. And so there was a man named Saul. He was the first king of the nation of Israel, but Saul wanted control for himself. So God removed him and he raised up a man named David who slayed Goliath, David who was willing to say, I will give up my control. He was a king who understood that even kings need to submit to the control of someone else. Even kings need a king. And so David, he submitted to God, and David had a son named Solomon, but it was after Solomon that things for the nation of Israel began to fall apart. The northern kingdom separated from the southern kingdom. The northern kingdom was known as Israel. The southern kingdom was known as Judah. And there was just one king after another deciding, will I turn inward or will I look upward? Will I surrender to God or will I submit to myself? And depending on how that king responded, whether they submitted to God or took control for themselves, it depended on which direction the nation went. Ultimately, you may know the story, they pushed God out. And in 722 BC, it's an important year, 722 BC, the Assyrians came in and they conquered the northern kingdom of Israel. It was decimated. The people were taken away into exile. The southern kingdom lasted a little while longer. Ultimately, a man named Nebuchadnezzar of the Babylonians came in, ransacked the city of Jerusalem, pillaged the temple, took exiles off to Babylon. That happened in 586 BC when the southern kingdom fell. That's when Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, if you know their stories, incredible men of faith, survived. They were taken into captivity for about 50 years. And they were spread across the ancient world, and it was total, utter chaos. They had no kingdom, they had no homeland. Frankly, many of them wondered if they even still had a god. Then Cyrus the Great of Persia conquered the Babylonians 538 BC. Again, you can just see it's one person fighting for control over another. Cyrus the Great came in, he sent the exiles home. He said, I want you to go back to your homeland, repopulate. You can rebuild your temple and everything will be great. He had this unusual policy that his vassals were able to worship their own gods. And so many did return, but many lived in the lands that they had moved to. Many had grown up in these foreign lands. They had no idea what it was like to even grow up in Jerusalem, to grow up in Palestine. And little did they know at the point that Cyrus the Great kind of set them free, that there would be a 400-year period of silence from God, a 400-year period of people fighting to be in control. There's a prophet who spoke. He's considered the last prophet of the Old Testament, of the Jewish scriptures. His name was Malachi. And here's what Malachi said. He predicted this would happen in the future. He says, but for you who revere my name, for you who submit control to me, he says, the Son of Righteousness will rise with healing in its rays. You will go out and frolic like well-fed calves. Who doesn't want to do that? This is language from, 2,500 years ago. Then you will trample on the wicked. They will be ashes under the soles of your feet on the day when I act, says the Lord Almighty. In other words, if you surrender control, I'll take responsibility for you and I will bless you. I have not forgotten the promise that I gave to Abraham so many years ago that if he would surrender to me, that I would make him into a great nation that wouldn't be known for conquering people, but that would be known for blessing people. How would God prevail? How would God prevail during this period of time? This period of 400 years is known as what's called the intertestamental period. So there's 400 years from the time the last prophet spoke to the beginning of what we call the New Testament. 400 years, essentially, where God was silent. They didn't hear the voice of God. They didn't hear the direction of God. They just had to wait, wondering, frankly, wandering. See, the thing about control is that when control comes in conflict, chaos results. When people are fighting for control, it's chaos. Whether it's in a nation, look what's happening in America right now, whether it's in a family, whether it's across the globe, when people fight for control, the result is chaos. And there was absolute chaos during this time period. As the Jews tried to figure out what to do, where to live, who they were, their identity, some of them tried to set up synagogues in different areas so that they could try and worship God as best they maybe could without really surrendering to Him. Some totally abandoned God because it was just easier to fit into their new cultures. And it was a very turbulent time that had begun. We can put this timeline up here. It began with the Persian rule, but then in 332 BC, a man named Alexander the Great came from Macedonia, conquering the ancient world. Alexander was trained by Greek philosophers like Plato, and he came to conquer as king to bring in this kind of one world government, one world religion, one world thought. And at the top of his thinking was not God. At the top of his thinking was humanity. Humans were God. So he built gymnasiums for athletics and academics. He built stadiums and hippodromes where they would have horse racing. I mean, it was just all about elevating humanity. They built theaters. And the best you could sum up what Alexander the Great did is that the measure of all things is man. What's fascinating is that when Alexander the Great conquered the region of Palestine, he died just a few years later at the young age of 32. Imagine. And so suddenly, there were two generals who served under Alexander the Great who began fighting for control. Their names were Ptolemy and Seleucus. And Palestine was in the middle of these two generals. So, as we continue in the timeline, there's this season of the Ptolemies and the Seleucids fighting for control. The Ptolemies had control of the region to begin with, and they were generous to the Jews. They allowed them to continue in their worship of God. In fact, they took a group of Jews to Alexandria, the ancient city. Ptolemy II commissioned a Greek version of the Old Testament, or the Jewish scriptures, to be made. We call that the Septuagint today, and it's the source for much of what we understand about the Old Testament. But over time, the Seleucids came into control. And the Seleucids overpowered the Ptolemies, and it came to a head with a man named Antiochus Epiphanes. Antiochus did not want Judaism to continue, so he had copies of the Jewish law burned. He forbade circumcision, which was so important to the Jewish people. He sold the high priesthood. He built a gymnasium for naked athletes, which was an abomination to the Jews. He looted the temple, and the worst of his sins was he went into the Holy of Holies, the place where it was believed God dwelled, in the temple of Jerusalem. And he built an altar to Zeus, and he sacrificed a pig on that altar. There's a kind of group of writings called the Apocrypha that take place during this 400-year period. We don't believe they're inspired by God, but they're historical accounts. And here's what one of those apocryphal writings, it's called First Maccabees, records about Antiochus Epiphanes. It says, according to the decree that Antiochus made, they put to death the women who had children circumcised, their families and those who circumcised them, and they hung the infants from their mothers' necks. Continuing on, but many in Israel stood firm and were resolved in their hearts not to eat unclean food. They chose to die rather than to be defiled by food or to profane the holy covenant, and they did die. Very great wrath came upon Israel. I mean, these were God's chosen people, but where was God? Chaos reigned during this incredible time period. And the thing was, the Israelites had failed to surrender to God, and so he allowed them to suffer the consequences. Well, eventually, this was too much. And there was a man named Mattathias who began the Maccabean Rebellion. Perhaps you've heard of that before. His family fled into the wilderness. They began guerrilla warfare. He had a son named Judas Maccabeus who received the nickname the Hammer because he was such a powerful person. He used his valor, he used his military might to bring, the Seleucids under control, to push them out. He helped to lead the Israelites to a newfound freedom. He cleansed the temple. He brought religious reform. Maccabees says this about Judas Maccabeus, that he searched out and pursued those who broke the law. He burned those who troubled his people. Lawbreakers shrank back for fear of him, and all the evildoers were confounded, and deliverance prospered by his hand. The temple was rededicated on December 14th, 154 BC, at which time a miracle took place that the Jews now celebrate as Hanukkah. So by 135, essentially, the Jewish people were back under their own reign, back under their own control, because they had a stronger, smarter, slicker person who was able to come in and take control back to bring an end to the chaos. So they had this period of independence. And what it solidified for them was that they needed a powerful king. They needed a ruler in the vein of the hammer. They needed a ruler in the vein of Alexander the Great, who would come in and conquer in the direction they wanted things conquered in. They needed someone with strength. The problem was, even their person with strength eventually died, and eventually the Romans in 63 BC, under Pompey, came in and conquered Jerusalem. But, as is typical, there were fights for who was going to be in control. And so Pompey had his own little conflict going on with Julius Caesar. Eventually, Antony and Cleopatra were tied up into it, and a man named Octavian, who was the adopted nephew of Julius Caesar. And when it all came to an end, Octavian ended up on top. He received the title Caesar Augustus. Perhaps you've heard of Caesar Augustus. And he established a 200-year period of time known as the Pax Romana, or the Roman peace. Because finally, the wars were seemingly over. Finally, this general peace abounded. Peace at the expense of freedom. Prosperity at the expense of a few. But it was at least a civilized government. The region of Palestine, where the Jews lived, where Jerusalem was under the authority of a man named King Herod, who served under Caesar Augustus. It was a nation inside a nation, and yet the Jews had this promise that there would be a king, that there would be a Messiah, that there would be someone who would come and rescue them. Someone perhaps like Judas Maccabeus, or Alexander the Great, someone with power. And the irony is, I've been thinking through all this. The irony is that everyone wants the same type of king, right? We all want the same type of king. We want somebody who's going to bring our opposition into submission. We want somebody who's going to come in and push our agenda and do what it is that we think needs to be done and elevate us and our needs and what it is that we want. I mean, that's the type of king that the world's looking for, to control chaos with order, to advance our agenda. A king that we can control. Essentially, Israel, do you know what they wanted? They wanted their own brand of Caesar. Just one who would rule in their favor, rather than in the favor of the Roman Empire. And as a result, it's one nation trading kings for another. It's fighting for control. And whoever's slickest, whoever's smartest, whoever's most powerful, whoever's the most conniving comes in, until someone who's slicker or more powerful or more conniving takes over. So, if you were God, what kind of king would you send into your weary world? The weary world that you created, where everyone wants to be in control, where everyone wants to be the king. I was thinking about this kind of 400-year time period, and I was just asking myself the question, God, why were you silent for 400 years? I mean, where were you during this time period? And I'm sure there are lots of answers to that. In some sense, it's like the world was taking a deep breath and realizing what takes place when people fight for control. I mean, the Roman Empire, honestly, was kind of the best the world had to offer. As much as, it was ruthless in many respects, it at least gave a sense of relative peace in the region. That Pax Romana for 200 years. I mean, that began with that began with Caesar Augustus. And yet it was modeled after the concept of the gods and goddesses who were known for their pride, their arrogance, their selfishness. I mean, it was just all about them all the time. And that really, humanity was the apex of it. Now, the thing that I got to think about is that God's silence allowed the world to see the best humanity could get without him. And it was bloodthirsty and power hungry, and it devalued some people at the expense of others, and it was total chaos. And yet it was into the crucible of this world of people fighting for control that God sent a different kind of king. Not one who would come in power, not one who was even born to a royal family, in a royal city, in a palace. Not one who came wielding strength. In fact, you probably know the story that God sent an angel to a woman named Mary who was living in the small town of Nazareth. And here's what the angel said to her: "Don't be afraid, Mary. You found favor with God. You will conceive and give birth to a son, and you are to call him Jesus." He goes on and says this. He says, "He will be great and will be called the Son of the Most High. The Lord God will give him the throne." He's going to be a king, right? Kings have thrones. "The Lord will give him the throne of his father David." David, who was a different king. David, who was the most godly king the nation had ever known. David, who submitted his control to God. He'll give him the throne of his father David, and he will reign over Jacob's descendants forever. His kingdom will never end. No one more powerful will come along. He is the King of kings. He will be the Lord of lords, and he'll come and he will be great, not like Alexander the Great, not like Judas Maccabeus Great. He'll bring strength through restraint. Strength through restraint. Imagine. He'll influence others by serving. He'll give hope through love. And because of where the world was, this was so unrecognizable. It was so different than anything the world had ever seen. John, when he was reflecting back, he wrote this about the advent of Jesus. He said, "The true light that gives light to everyone was coming into the world. He was in the world, and though the world was made through him, the world did not recognize him because he was so altogether different. His light illuminated the darkness. His reign would elevate those who were weak. The disadvantaged now had the advantage, and the powerless finally had an advocate, someone who cared for them in this upside-down kingdom where people would learn to use their strength for the good of others, to use their power and leverage what they have to raise someone else up." In the conversation Jesus was having with his disciples, Matthew recorded this for us. Jesus called them together and said, "You know that the rulers of the Gentiles, the kings of the Gentiles, they lord it over them." In other words, I use my authority for my own benefit, for my own strength, for my own power. "And their high officials exercise authority over them, power for my own benefit." That is how the world works, isn't it? It's power for my benefit, to get my agenda passed, to do the things that I want to do. But Jesus said, my world's going to be different. He said, "Not so with you. Not so with you. Instead, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant. And whoever wants to be first must be your slave, just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many." He didn't cling to his life. He didn't cling to his power. He did not cling to his control. Instead, he leveraged all of those things for the good of you, for the good of me, for the good of the whole world. And at the birth of Jesus, the blessing that had been promised to Abraham 2,000 years before was born. That the world would have a new king, a different king, a king who did not come in the vein of every other king. And the ironic part is, as much as he came to be a different kind of king, he ended up on top. Julius Caesar is now a footnote in Jesus' story. Jesus is not a footnote in his. And the fascinating thing is that we still, even followers of Jesus, if you call yourself a follower of Jesus, isn't it true that every one of us has an area of our life where we still fight for control? In fact, in a world that's still fighting for control, and that's kind of what we want, right? As soon as the Democrats take over, the Republicans want to take over. As soon as the Republicans take over, the Democrats want to take over, right? I mean, we just all want control. We all want to have things our way. We all want to move things in our direction. Everyone in this world is fighting for control. And yet we followers of Jesus, we have a special opportunity. We have an opportunity to welcome the birth of a different kind of king. One who didn't fight to be in control, but who operates in the opposite way the world operates. Said, I want you to give up your control. I want you to come follow me. Give up your need to control. And when you do that, I'll take responsibility for you. I'll bless the world through you. So I want to ask you an important question, and I don't think it's a question that you can answer right now. Even as much as if you grew up in church, if you're a Jesus person, you're going to think you know the answer to this. But I think this is a question that we all, myself included, need to wrestle with, especially during this season as we celebrate the birth of this different king. And the question is, who is the king of your life? Really? Right? Who is the king of your life, really? When you realize your world is out of control, where do you turn? Do you turn inward? Do you turn outward? Some political leader who might rescue? Your parents? Or do you turn upward? That's an indication of who's king. Your default response in those moments when things suddenly seem out of control. What I think is fascinating, and I know I've said this many times, so if you've been a part of this church for a while, you've heard me say it before. Jesus never forced people to surrender to him. Ever. Ever. A king, unlike any other king. I mean, Jesus at one point in time said to his disciples, hey, do you guys want to go? Because I'm not forcing you to stay. And yet they willingly said, where else would we turn? No one else has given us the answers to life. No one else has ended up on top 2,000 years later. The kingdom of this King of Kings is still going. And it doesn't seem to be ending anytime soon. And when we're willing to surrender our control, we have the privilege of living out the blessing that God promised to Abraham 4,000 years ago. In fact, wherever we go, and one of the most inspiring things as we share stories of what God is doing through our church here in Greensburg up the road, to see us bless our communities. What a privilege. What a privilege to bless our communities and to be known for making a difference. When you think about the people in your life, whether it's your neighbors or your coworkers or your family members, would they say they're blessed because you're in their lives? Are their lives better off? I mean, that's a better way of asking that question. Are their lives better off because you're there? Because of the relationship they have with you? When people surrender to Jesus as King, we inevitably bless the people around us. That's part of fulfilling the promise that Abraham received from God so many years ago. So who is king of your life? Is your life in chaos? Maybe like that 400-year period of time where the world was looking around for who's going to be in control. Maybe you've been trying to be in control, and maybe you realize that it's been chaos. Maybe there's an opportunity this Christmas season to surrender to the King for the first time. The King who didn't push himself to the top, but ended up there. The King who came to give his life because he loves you so much, to demonstrate what his love looked like by sacrificing himself, by refusing to take control, and inviting his followers to do the same. So we're going to pick it up right back there next week, part 2 of the King. Let me pray for us. Heavenly Father, thank you for the gift of Jesus that we celebrate this season. Father, it would be so easy to go through this time and the chaos and everything we have going on around us and just forget to pause and forget to consider the significance of what the advent of Jesus really means. Father, in a world that was so chaotic, the birth of a different kind of king was like light entering darkness. Father, would you help us to be that? Would you help us to be the light entering darkness in our communities, in our world, a world that is still in chaos where everyone's fighting for control? Would you let us be different? Father, for the person whose life is chaos right now, and they're just struggling, would you meet them in this space today? If they need to surrender to you as King, would you help them to do that? Would you help every one of us ultimately to surrender our control, that we may be a part of the blessing that was given to Abraham so many years ago? I ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen.